First thing I'm going to do, this is not part of the sermon, but I'm going to switch these. Because I think this one's a little bit better here. Here we go. Let's get a little bit more oomph, yeah. Okay. Growing up, one of my favorite subjects in school was math. And one of my first mind-bending mathematical truths that I discovered was in the simple form of an angle. Not a 90-degree angle. Those things are for squares. Thank you. I told you I liked math. And not a 45-degree angle, not a 30 or a 15-degree angle, but picture in your mind for just a moment a 1-degree angle. Because on a single sheet of paper, a 1-degree angle is barely perceptible. Near the vertex, where the two lines meet, the space between them is smaller than a single strand of hair. But as the two lines of the angle stretch on and on, the space between them becomes infinitely large. What at first seemed so small could eventually contain the entire universe. So is the 1-degree angle truly small, or is it actually massive? It depends entirely on where and how you choose to measure it. In other words, it's a matter of perspective. Our perspectives inform our beliefs and our behaviors, often without us even realizing it. Now, the festival of Sukkot demands that we change our perspectives. We shake the lulav in all of the directions. My favorite one is behind us, because it reminds us that God exists everywhere, including in our blind spots. We read Kohelet, which challenges our perspectives on time and purpose and wisdom. And perhaps the greatest perspective shift comes from actually building the Sukkah itself. For 8 days, we are expected to treat that flimsy hut as home, and our actual homes as temporary spaces. We temper the comfort and the stability of our modern lives with the fragility and temporality of physical existence. By building the Sukkah, we introduce a structural change that in turn alters our perspectives. But there's another Sukkot tradition that we unfortunately no longer practice, though it speaks directly to perceptual and structural change, and boy, was it fun. They called it the water drawing festival. And the sages of the Mishnah state emphatically, Kol misha lo ra'a simchat beit hashoeva, lo ra'a simcha miyamav. Anyone who hasn't witnessed the celebration of the water drawing festival has never seen joy in all their days. Apparently, the water drawing festival was the greatest party ever. There were trumpets and flutes and an extremely bright menorah, and there were rabbis juggling and doing handstands, somehow just balancing on just their thumbs. And there was water and wine and dancing and praying, and you're all here for second day Chag, so don't tell me you don't love praying. So you may think that you've experienced joy, but have you even been to the water festival? So we've established the water festival was an absolute rager. But before all the pomp and pageantry, Mishnah Sukkah describes a peculiar introduction to the festival. With everyone gathered on the Temple Mount, the priests would descend from the temple to the women's courtyard, Yardu le'ezrat nashim, umetaknin sham tikkun gadol. And they would institute a great tikkun. I'm going to leave the word tikkun untranslated for now, because the Talmud will have an explanation for what it means. So more on that in a moment. Suffice it to say that the discussion of the Great Tikkun leads the rabbis of the Talmud down a winding rabbit hole of tangents, which seems to be pretty par for the course when it comes to Talmud. And what they end up with is an illustration of the messianic future and the destruction of the Yetzer Hara. So that's classic Talmud. We start with Sukkot and a party, and then all of a sudden we're at the Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer Hara we often translate as the evil inclination, but the Yetzer Hara is better described as the self-serving impulse, in contrast to the Yetzer HaTov, which is the altruistic impulse. So according to the Babylonian Talmud, this is how it's going to go down. The Mashiach has come, and God reveals the Yetzer Hara to the whole world and then destroys it. And everybody weeps. To the righteous, who have in their lifetimes overcome the self-serving impulse, the Yetzer Hara appears as a massive mountain. The tzaddikim say to themselves, how is it that we were able to defeat this insurmountable obstacle? And they weep with joy. But those who fell short, those who succumbed to the self-serving impulse, the Yetzer Hara manifests to them as a strand of hair. And when the Reshaim see this, they ask themselves, how is it that we were unable to overcome so small an obstacle? And they weep with sorrow. The self-serving impulse as the mountain and the hair is a powerful metaphor. Strands of hair can be brushed aside, but mountains require climbing. Most of us, more often than not, underestimate the Yetzer Hara. We perceive each poor decision as only a minor deviation, like the imperceptible divergence of a 1-degree angle. If we mistakenly identify the Yetzer Hara as a strand of hair, we may never try to overcome it. But if we understand it as the immense challenge of our lives, then we will undertake the effort to climb that mountain. The first step in solving a problem is recognizing that the problem exists. It is upon each of us personally to regulate our own self-serving impulses, but it is upon our society to ensure that the insidious Yetzer Hara does not also infect our social institutions. Which brings us to the great tikkun. And I should let you know, one of perhaps the least fun facts about me is that I am totally fascinated by the halachic process, by Jewish law. How Jewish law and practice developed from Torah to Mishnah to Talmud to codes and responsa, and how that all interacts with the stories that we tell ourselves. Which is why the Tikkun Gadol caught my eye. Over the millennia, our sages have occasionally instituted ordinances, amendments to Jewish law and practices. These ordinances were called takanot, coming from the Hebrew root taf kuf nun, from letaken, to fix or repair. Similar to regular halachot and teshuvot, Jewish laws and responsa, takanot, are founded upon biblical text and Jewish values. But where halachot and teshuvot address all matters of Jewish practice, including how to keep a kosher home and how to build a kosher sukkah, takanot seem to be established specifically to prevent institutional flaws from turning into systemic injustices. In other words, takanot are made to protect the vulnerable. The word tikkun is often interchangeable with the word takana, coming from the same root, and it refers to a legal or a structural change. So when the Mishnah says that the priests instituted a tikkun gadol, we would be right to wonder which laws they changed or what buildings they built. Now here's the part that's going to ruffle some feathers. The Babylonian Talmud is similarly intrigued by the Mishnah, so the sages ask, "My tikkun gadol, what was this great repair?" And the answer, hikifuha gezustra, the priests built a gezustra, a balcony, around the women's courtyard where everyone was celebrating. Vehitkinu sheyehu nashim yoshvot milamala, venashim yoshvim milamata. And they legally instituted that women sit above and men sit below. I have to admit, I was seriously disappointed. I'm hearing hissing. Wow. I was seriously disappointed when I read the Talmudic explanation. You're telling me that this thing, the most exciting thing about the water drying festival, this tikkun gadol, this great repair, was the founding text for a mechitza? That all of my hard work, and now I'm stuck with this mechitza, you know? So they're cordoning off all of the women simply because the men couldn't be trusted to control themselves? But the tikkun gadol, at least the way that the Talmud understands it, is actually a perfect example of the power of perspective. The tikkun was intended to protect a vulnerable population from the adverse influence of the Yetzer Hara. But simply building a balcony doesn't help men subdue their covetous urges, it just segregates women out of communal life. Rather than fencing out the Yetzer Hara, the tikkun fenced out half the population. The women's balcony illustrates how the lines that we draw today to keep people safe may instead function to keep people out. How a small nudge, a 1-degree course correction, could one day widen into an irreparable chasm. How yesterday's tikkun could be today's mountain. And even if we concede that the first tikkun gadol was the balcony and the separate seating, what was the second tikkun gadol? Rabbinic legal amendments don't typically have expiration dates, so it wouldn't make sense to institute the same ordinance again the following year. But the Mishnah wasn't describing a one-time repair. Every year, the priests would establish another great tikkun, another repair. And so I admit that I think the Talmud got it wrong, or at least that a critical dimension has been overlooked. Consider when all of this is taking place. Less than a week ago, we were all fasting, baring our souls to God, reflecting on the ways that we've fallen short individually and collectively, all the ways that we've succumbed to the self-serving impulse, and all the ways that we've then taken advantage of others. If there is any time in the Jewish calendar that we clearly see the Yetzer Hara for the mountain that it is, it's right now, fresh off of Yom Kippur. And during the Yamim Noraim, we tend to focus on the personal reflection and growth, but Sukkot is a time for building, for making concrete, structural, and collective change. In fact, this is the true final step of the process of teshuvah. We build safeguards to prevent us from making the same mistakes again. So instead of a mechitza, I would like to imagine that every year during Sukkot, the priests would inaugurate this raucous water festival with a new tikkun. The most joyous celebration in Judaism began with a deliberate attempt to repair our fraying social fabric. Now, what I like most about this interpretation is the symbolism of making a great repair every Sukkot, and how that might change our perspective of Jewish law. Like the Sukkah, Jewish law should be flexible and portable, rather than rigid or permanent. We invoke our ancestors and our values and our traditions in Jewish law, just as we invite the ushpizin and the ushpizot into our Sukkah. Jewish law, like the Sukkah, should have a semi-permeable membrane. It should allow the surrounding environment in. And it may not be perfect, but we still make it beautiful, and we still call it home. Meanwhile, we live in a society that not only enables the self-serving impulse, we worship it. Greed and discrimination are destroying human lives, not to mention our democracy and our environment. And the problem is becoming insurmountable. We need new takanot to protect the vulnerable, to save our society from those who seek only to serve themselves. And the hardest part about being bound by our own perspectives is that the repairs we make today could potentially create other problems in the future. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. A final word regarding the story of the mountain and the hare, and the end of the Yetzer Hara. The wording of the Midrash places the righteous and the wicked in the plural. The tzaddikim are together when they see the mountain. And they say, He'ach yacholnu lichbosh har gevoha kazeh. How were we able to conquer this great mountain? And the answer to their question can be found in the language of the question itself. How were we able to conquer the mountain? Not how was I able to? One person's strand of hair may be another person's mountain. Every decision is guided by perception or misperception. And the way to avoid being confined by our own misperceptions is by listening to one another. Together, The tzaddikim correctly perceived the mountain, and so together they climbed it. Each new perspective is a wealth of information that we may have missed, an entire reality beyond the narrow scope of our own personal experiences. Don't be fooled by the 1 degree angle. It could be someone else's whole world. We can help one another identify our greatest challenges. The time for tikkun is right now. And until we make our next great repair, we can and we will continue to climb the mountain together. Someday, God willing, we may just weep with joy. Chag Sameach.